Soon, of course, the sun will be setting on a spectacular California day, but this morning it was tucked behind somber clouds and rain in Washington as the nation began the final goodbye to its 40th president. A very public day began with private words. A moment of tenderness. Nancy Reagan caressing the casket, appearing to speak to her husband one last time. With this, the nation witnessed the ritual of the first presidential state funeral since Lyndon Johnson, 31 years ago. At the National Cathedral, former presidents Ford, Carter, Bush, and Clinton joined President George W. Bush and dignitaries from around the world. Many of today's speakers were chosen personally by President Reagan. Former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney spoke of Reagan the statesman.
Ronald Reagan was a president who inspired his nation and transformed the world.
And former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher spoke of Reagan the friend.
In his lifetime, Ronald Reagan was such a cheerful and invigorating presence that it was easy to forget what daunting historic tasks he set himself.
Too frail for public speaking after suffering a series of strokes, Mrs. Thatcher recorded her remarks months ago.
Amazing grace.
And then these emotional words from President Reagan's loyal vice president.
As his vice president for 8 years, I learned more from Ronald Reagan than from anyone I encountered in all my years of public life.
And from President George W. Bush.
His convictions were always politely stated, affably argued, and as firm and straight as the columns of this cathedral.
As the family looked on, the president paid tribute to the love of Ronald Reagan's life.
In a life of good fortune, he valued above all the gracious gift of his wife, Nancy. During his career, Ronald Reagan passed through 1,000 crowded places. But there was only one person, he said, who could make him lonely by just leaving the room.
Ronald Reagan's final goodbye in the nation's capital. A 21-gun salute for the former commander-in-chief at Andrews Air Force Base and the long journey home to his resting place in California. As we watch the procession continue towards the library, Jim Coon, we all were, I think, moved by the majesty of what we saw unfold here in Washington today. You were actually at the service at the National Cathedral. Having been the executive assistant to President Reagan, what struck you most about the eulogies and the common thread we saw in the eulogies?
Certainly the remarks by Prime Minister Thatcher, former Prime Minister Thatcher, former Prime Minister Mulroney, but even more significantly, what former President Bush said, the impact that Ronald Reagan had on his life more so than anybody else in all of his public years.
Well, that was particularly, I think, touching to a lot of people to see is former President Bush and is one is publicly given to sharing his emotions.
Yes, and it's something that I think a lot of us that logged a lot of years with Ronald Reagan were hoping for and maybe expected years earlier when that exchange of power took place 15.5 years ago. And but once George Bush was always very gracious to the Reagans and was never ever in the 8 years that he was vice president was loyal, never upstaged president once. But there was never that significant statement that I guess we were all looking for, and it happened today. He's such a classman, and he waited until the final day to deliver those
And what were
words.
you looking for? Just the acknowledgement
Yes.
that Ronald Reagan was a different human being and what his contribution.
Correct. And he said it today.